Under the relentless blaze of the desert sun, where hope often dries up like the scarce water that trickles through cracked earth, an old cowboy made a choice that would change everything. Imagine a man, weathered by years of dust and solitude, stopping not to save himself, but to leave behind a small, precious gift: water in a place where no one expected kindness. It was a simple act, almost forgotten in the vast emptiness, yet it echoed far beyond that barren land. What happened next wasn't just surprising. It was a testament to the unexpected bonds forged in the harshest of places. The story begins with silence and hardship, where every drop of water could mean life or death, and strangers were as distant as the horizon. But sometimes, the smallest gestures have the power to awaken something bigger than survival. The old cowboy's quiet generosity planted a seed, one that grew overnight into a wave of gratitude no one could have predicted. 300 strangers, faces unknown, hearts touched, came together with a gift that carried the weight of respect, honor, and unspoken stories. You might wonder why these strangers traveled miles through the unforgiving desert, why they chose to honor a man who had given nothing but water. The answer lies deeper than the surface, nestled in the values of loyalty and humanity that define the Old West. In a land ruled by lawlessness and harsh realities, acts of kindness became legends, moments that brought people together in ways words never could. This tale is not just about a horse or a cowboy. It is about the invisible threads that connect us all, even when the world seems cold and indifferent. As you listen, you'll feel the weight of every step across that sun-scorched ground, the whispers of a time when honor was the currency, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The desert witnessed something rare, a miracle born from humility and courage. It's a story that challenges us to see beyond what's visible and to recognize that even in the loneliest places, kindness can ride in on the wind and change a life forever. Stay with me, because this is more than just a story from the Old West. It's a reminder that one simple act can ripple through countless lives, turning strangers into a family bound by respect. The old cowboy's gift was more than water. It was a beacon in the wilderness, a call to humanity that still speaks to us today. And what happened next? It will leave you speechless. The old cowboy, known only as Clay to the few who had crossed his path, had lived most of his years in silence. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. Deep in the Mojave, where men rarely passed, and even fewer survived without a compass and grit, Clay wandered not in search of gold or glory, but of meaning. One evening, he came across a broken trail, a path clearly used by desperate travelers. The sun had been cruel that day, and Clay knew what the night would bring: cold winds and no mercy. In his saddlebags, Clay had just enough water for another day's ride. But as he reached a flat, open stretch of dry land, where even the cactus curled from thirst, he stopped. Without a second thought, he took a battered tin canteen, filled it with the last of his water, and placed it under a jagged rock. Next to it, he carved into the dirt with his knife: "For the next soul that needs it. Ride safe." It wasn't a heroic gesture in his mind, just something a decent man should do. Yet, in a land where decency had become a rare commodity, that single act would carry more weight than he ever imagined. That night, Clay camped under a skeletal tree, the wind whispering like ghosts through the branches. He didn't know if anyone would find the canteen, or if it would be stolen or spilled, but he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. In a place where men had shot each other over a sip of whiskey, Clay had given something without expecting anything back. Not respect, not a handshake, not even survival. Just silence and the stars above, watching him like old friends. Unbeknownst to Clay, miles away, a family was desperately making their way through the same desert. A father, a pregnant wife, and a young boy with cracked lips and no tears left to cry. Their horses had collapsed from exhaustion. The father's skin had blistered in the sun, his voice hoarse from calling out to a god he wasn't sure still listened. When the boy stumbled upon that canteen, half buried and shimmering faintly in the sand, it was more than water. It was salvation. They drank, cautiously at first, as if afraid it might vanish. The mother wept. The father knelt in disbelief. That small act had saved 3 lives. And though they didn't know who Clay was or why he'd done it, they vowed that if they ever found the man, they'd repay him tenfold. But the desert has a strange way of carrying whispers, and this whisper was about to turn into a thunderstorm of gratitude. By morning, word had begun to travel. The father, Samuel Boone, was no ordinary man. He was a scout, once feared and respected in a territory marked by dust and lawlessness. Now, he was trying to leave the past behind, to build something better for his family. When he reached a small outpost a day later, he told the barkeep about the stranger who left water in the sand. The story struck the old man's heart like a hammer. He had once lost a brother to dehydration out near the same pass. That same night, he shared the tale with a cattle herder, who passed it on to a merchant, who passed it on to a preacher. Like wildfire in dry grass, the legend of the water canteen spread, not as a tale of luck, but as a miracle in a land that had forgotten what compassion looked like. Each retelling added another layer. Some said the cowboy was a ghost. Others claimed he was an angel in disguise. But the truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the ripple Clay had unknowingly started. In a land built on grudges and gunpowder, this was a story that made even the hardest men stop and think. Meanwhile, Clay had moved on. He wasn't running from anything, just drifting like tumbleweed on the breeze. He found shelter in an old mining cabin, where he fixed a broken door and fed a stray dog that had followed him for 2 days. Life was simple, quiet, but something in his chest began to stir, an ache he hadn't felt in years. Not pain, but a strange warmth. Like maybe, just maybe, he was still capable of doing something that mattered. Back in the nearest town, a group of ranchers met in silence. Each had lost someone to the desert's cruelty. They didn't speak of vengeance or justice. Instead, they organized a ride. Not for a posse, but a procession. A thank you ride. 300 strong, from drifters to deputies, all gathering not to find the cowboy, but to honor him. Every man brought something: saddles, oats, tools, but one brought a horse. A fine Appaloosa, trained for war but gentle enough to carry a child. They rode out at dawn, cutting through the sand like an old cavalry reborn. No one had seen Clay in days, but the desert remembers. And as the dust rose behind their hooves, the spirits of the Old West stirred, watching with the same quiet reverence that Clay had offered just days before. Clay had no idea that 300 strangers were heading in his direction, nor that his small gesture had bloomed into legend. On the third morning after leaving the canteen, he sat quietly by a dwindling campfire, mending his old boots with a dull needle and a piece of twine. The wind had shifted, warmer, carrying distant sounds. He thought it might be thunder, but the sky was clear. The stray dog beside him barked once and looked to the horizon. That was when Clay saw the dust cloud. It wasn't a storm. It was movement, deliberate, steady, and coming fast. Instinct told Clay to hide. The West had taught him that men who traveled in groups rarely came bearing gifts. But something made him stay seated. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was that deep part of him that was tired of running. He stood, squinting against the sun, hand hovering near the old Colt strapped to his hip. But what he saw next stopped him cold. A child led the procession, holding a white scarf tied to a stick. No rifles, no threats, just faces, sunburned, weathered, many unfamiliar, but none hostile. The first man to dismount was Samuel Boone. He stepped forward, hat in hand, and introduced himself with no grand speech. "You saved my family," he said. "You didn't know us. You still don't. But you gave us water, and now we give you thanks." Behind him, one by one, others followed. An old woman placed a loaf of bread in Clay's hands. A blacksmith offered him a new pair of boots. A preacher gave him a Bible wrapped in leather. Then came the Appaloosa. The horse was tall, proud, and calm. Its eyes seemed to recognize something in Clay, perhaps the same quiet nobility it carried. The man who brought it didn't speak. He simply handed over the reins, tipped his hat, and walked away. Clay stared at the animal, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected it. He had merely done what he felt was right. And yet, here they were, 300 strangers, bound not by blood, but by a single act of grace. Clay didn't cry. He hadn't cried in decades. But something inside him cracked, softened, made room for light. He whispered a thank you, so quiet only the wind heard it. Then, without instruction, the crowd began to disband. Some stayed for a meal. Others rode off in silence. But none would forget what they had seen: a cowboy who gave a sip of water, and in return, received a river of gratitude. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in gold and amber, Clay sat beside his new horse, stroking its mane with a kind of awe. He felt younger, not in body, but in spirit, as if something heavy had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was remembered, honored, not for his past, but for a moment of compassion that spoke louder than any legend could. Stories began to circle like vultures on the wind. Children would whisper about the desert cowboy, the man who gave life with nothing but a canteen and a quiet soul. Some called him a saint, others a fool, but all agreed on one thing: what he did could not be bought or taught. It was the kind of goodness that came from the marrow, the kind this world rarely sees and never forgets. Clay didn't return to town. He didn't need to. The desert had become his church, his home, and now, a place of meaning. Every so often, riders would appear on the horizon just to shake his hand, leave him food, or sit quietly beside his fire. They didn't come for answers. They came for peace. Because something about that place, and the man who lived there, made people feel human again. One night, a woman arrived carrying a child wrapped in wool. She told Clay her husband had died crossing the flats, and she wouldn't have made it had someone not told her where to find the well that wasn't there. Clay nodded. He had never built a well, but the canteen had become a symbol, and symbols have power. He gave her his blanket, showed her the trail out, and wished her strength. She kissed his hand before leaving. That winter, when the winds turned bitter and most folks sought shelter, Clay stayed in the desert. With the Appaloosa by his side, and the memory of 300 strangers etched in his heart, he carved a new path through silence. And though he never spoke of the day they came, he would often look to the horizon and smile, knowing that somewhere out there, people still believed in the kind of man he had chosen to be. The following spring, the desert bloomed in ways few had ever witnessed. Scraggly sage turned a timid green, and brittle wildflowers pushed through sand as if answering some secret invitation. Clay rode the Appaloosa along the old mail trail, pausing at places where desperate travelers once carved their names into stone. He began leaving canteens at every mile marker, each one wrapped in burlap and sealed with wax, etched with the simple words, "Drink and ride on." These small, silent offerings soon became lifelines for wanderers caught between scorching days and frigid nights. Word of Clay's hidden canteen line spread beyond the Mojave, carried by merchant caravans and Pony Express riders who felt compelled to protect the route. Rival gangs that once preyed upon lone riders started to avoid the trail, wary of angering the mysterious benefactor whose legend had grown larger than any six-gun reputation. In dusty saloons from Tucson to Santa Fe, roughnecks argued over whether the desert cowboy even existed, or if he was a collective dream born of shared guilt and thirst. Yet every skeptic fell silent when someone produced a wax-sealed canteen as proof, still cool despite the punishing sun. One evening, Clay encountered a riderless mule dragging a shattered wagon wheel. Tied to the saddle horn was a journal, its pages warped by sun and sweat. Inside, a mother had chronicled her family's doomed journey, until the ink trailed off where thirst overtook her words. Clay followed the mule's tracks through shifting dunes until he found the woman and her 2 children huddled beneath a rocky overhang. They were alive but fading fast. With steady hands, he shared water, shade, and quiet reassurance, nursing them back to strength over 2 relentless days and nights. As the mother recovered, she confided that her husband, a geologist, had discovered a hidden spring months earlier, deep in the Badlands. Before he could stake a claim, raiders had ambushed their camp and driven him off the map. Clay's eyes hardened at the mention of raiders. He knew the territory's most ruthless band, led by a man named Jeb "Black Jack" Rowe. Rowe's gang had ruled the canyons for years, trading bullets for supplies and hope for fear. Clay listened, then nodded, the kind of slow, deliberate nod that meant storms were gathering. He escorted the family to a frontier mission where nuns offered refuge and bread. Before leaving, Clay slipped the journal into the priest's hands with instructions to send word about the hidden spring to every town council between Yuma and El Paso. Then he tightened his saddle cinch, adjusted his battered hat, and turned the Appaloosa toward the canyons. Clay was not riding for revenge. He was riding for balance. Somewhere in those jagged valleys, greed was poisoning the very lifeblood the desert had bestowed, and Clay intended to set things right. The canyons rose like jagged cathedrals, their crimson walls whispering tales of ambush and betrayal. Clay advanced at dusk, when shadows stretched long and rifles tended to misfire. He moved with the patience of a seasoned tracker, tracing faint hoof prints and discarded cartridge cases that glittered like evil stars in the sand. Each sign confirmed what he already sensed. Blackjack Rose Gang had grown bolder, confiscating water and claiming the hidden spring as their private treasury. Denying travelers a drink in the desert was worse than theft. It was a slow execution. Near a moonlit bend, Clay spotted sentries lounging beside a dwindling, cooking fire. He dismounted and approached on foot, heart beating in a quiet, measured cadence. With deft fingers, he loosened the Appaloosa's reins, letting the horse drift behind a thicket. Then Clay crept forward, boots muffled by soft dust, until he stood within a dozen paces of the outlaws. He called out, a single word, low and calm, causing their heads to jerk up in surprise. Before they could reach for rifles, his Colt was drawn, steady as sunrise. He ordered them to lay down arms and stand aside. Something in his eyes, or perhaps in the legend surrounding him, made resistance crumble like sandstone. Inside the narrow gorge, Blackjack Rowe lounged beside a spring that trickled clear as crystal, a rare, precious vein in the earth. Barrels and canteens encircled the pool, guarded by men whose expressions were etched with arrogance. When Clay strode into the clearing, silence spread like wildfire in reverse, sucking all sound into a vacuum of disbelief. Rowe recognized him, the man who had turned ghosts into stories and stories into moral reckonings. Still, he sneered, believing numbers and cruelty would outweigh honor and resolve. Clay spoke little. He explained that the spring belonged to none and to all, and that any man who rationed life water for profit had crossed an unforgivable line. Rowe laughed, his hand drifting toward the ivory grip of his revolver. Before metal met leather, Clay fired a single warning shot that shattered a barrel, sending water streaming across parched ground. The outlaws flinched as the lifeblood they hoarded soaked into dust. In that moment, Clay's intention was clear. He would rather spill every drop than let greed choke the desert. Tension hung thicker than gun smoke. But then an unexpected sound echoed through the gorge, the distant thunder of hooves. From both canyon mouths, riders appeared, scouts, ranchers, townsfolk, those who had once joined the 300-strong procession. They had followed Clay's quiet trail, drawn by whispers of Rowe's tyranny. Surrounded, Rowe's men dropped their weapons, realizing the tide had turned. Clay holstered his Colt and stepped aside as the crowd approached the spring. Buckets were filled, canteens passed, wounds washed. No vengeance, only restoration. As moonlight reflected in the fresh pools forming at their feet, Clay felt a profound stillness settle over the canyon. The desert, so often ruthless, was momentarily at peace. Yet he knew balance required vigilance. He stayed until dawn, ensuring Rowe's gang had departed and the spring was freely flowing. Then, with the Appaloosa's reins in hand and purpose steady in his chest, Clay rode toward the rising sun, ready for whatever trail the vast, untamed West would carve next. The ride back to the plains was quiet, the kind of silence that only follows a storm of the soul. Clay didn't celebrate, didn't linger in the glow of what had just unfolded. That wasn't his nature. He'd done what needed to be done, not for praise, but because in the Old West, there were still men who understood that justice wasn't always about laws. It was about doing right by the land and the people who dared cross it. As the sun rose over the mesas, painting the sky with streaks of rose and rust, Clay rode on, a solitary figure against an awakening horizon. By the time he returned to the mission, the family he had saved had already moved on, leaving behind a note pressed between two stones. It simply read, "You gave us a future. May you never ride alone." Clay folded it gently and placed it inside his vest, over his heart. He didn't need names or promises. That sentence carried more truth than any sermon. Still, something in it stayed with him. For the first time in years, he wondered what it might feel like to stop writing, to stay, to build something. But the West rarely gave such luxuries without asking for something in return. The preacher at the mission told Clay that since the spring had been freed, a caravan trail had formed. Families now traveled that path with confidence, knowing there were canteens hidden like blessings along the way. They called it the water trail, and some had even started painting marks on stones to help others find it. Clay didn't react with pride. He only nodded, the way a man does when he sees his shadow growing longer, not out of ego, but because the sun is setting behind him. That evening, a girl arrived at the mission with cracked boots and a rusted harmonica. She played a tune no one recognized, soft, lonesome, but brave. When asked where she learned it, she pointed to the desert and said, "A cowboy gave me a drink, and that sound came to me after." Clay watched her from a distance, eyes narrowed, smile hidden beneath his beard. The music reminded him of something, perhaps a time before scars, when he believed the world could be shaped by stories instead of gunpowder. He left the mission before dawn, not out of necessity, but instinct. He was the kind of man who belonged to the horizon, to the spaces between towns where wind and memory danced. And though he never said goodbye, the people there remembered him. They spoke of a quiet rider who gave water and walked away. And in the years to come, every time a canteen was found in the sand or a stranger offered water without asking why, someone would whisper, "Clay's still out there." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The story had already taken root. As spring turned to summer, and the heat once again ruled the desert like a cruel monarch, Clay found himself near the cliffs of painted rock. The stones there were marked with symbols older than the railroads, older than the gun. Petroglyphs carved by hands who lived by the sun and died by the stars. He sat beneath them for hours, watching a hawk circle overhead. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He had simply come to listen. Sometimes, the land spoke louder than any man, if you were quiet enough to hear it. He met an old tracker there, a man named Elias who walked with a limp and eyes full of broken fire. Elias had once been a bounty hunter, the kind whose name brought shivers to wanted men. But time had softened him, or maybe just humbled him. He shared his fire with Clay and spoke of a boy lost in the mountain passes, a boy with a crooked smile and no fear in his heart. Elias had searched for years and found only rumors. Clay listened, then offered something better than words. He offered to help. The two men rode together for the first time, strangers bound by purpose. It was a quiet companionship, built not on talk, but on trust. In the canyons, Clay taught Elias how to read wind trails again, how to tell the difference between coyote and boy by footprint spacing. Elias, in turn, taught Clay how to trap water from stone and sleep with one eye open without losing rest. They were not trying to be heroes. They were simply trying to keep a promise the world had already forgotten. Weeks passed, and though they didn't find the boy, they found signs, a slingshot tucked in a hollow tree, a name etched on bark, half erased by time. It was enough. Sometimes, finding proof that someone tried to survive is all a man needs to carry on. They returned to the town where the boy's mother still lit a candle each night, and Elias placed the slingshot on her porch. She never asked how or where. She only wept, holding the wooden handle like a relic from heaven. That night, Clay sat by the fire and stared into the flames until they blurred. He saw a boy with wide eyes and dust-covered cheeks standing beneath the dying sun. He didn't know if it was memory or dream, but he understood something new. Some men ride to find peace, others to bring it. And maybe his trail, with all its turns and scars, wasn't about where it led, but about how many people it touched along the way. The days stretched on like the horizon, vast, golden, and unpromising. Clay wandered farther west now, drawn by nothing more than instinct and the changing winds. Each town he passed whispered his name without knowing they did. In the saloons, drunks spoke of a man who never asked for payment, only left water behind. At trading posts, mothers told children that if they ever got lost, they should look for the canteen in the rocks. The myth had grown larger than the man, but Clay never sought the myth. He rode to stay ahead of it. In a remote village near the edge of a dry riverbed, Clay encountered a boy digging into the earth with a spoon. The child's hands were blistered, lips cracked, but his eyes burned with hope. They said there used to be water here, the boy muttered, not even looking up. Clay dismounted, knelt beside him, and helped dig with bare hands. After an hour, a damp patch appeared beneath the dust. Clay showed the boy how to hollow out the space and line it with cool stones. Water slowly pooled, enough to cup in a hand. The boy cried, not from pain, but from the quiet arrival of a miracle. The boy's father appeared not long after. A miner, worn thin by drought and broken promises. He tried to offer Clay gold dust in exchange. Clay refused with a gentle nod and handed the man a flint kit instead. "You'll need fire more than treasure," he said. As he turned to leave, the boy asked his name. Clay hesitated, then smiled faintly. Just someone who remembers what it means to be thirsty. It was the only answer the desert needed. Further down the trail, Clay found an old telegraph station buried in sand, abandoned and rattled by wind. Inside, the wires still hummed faintly. He spent the night repairing what he could, reattaching loose cables, and scribbling down a message. He tapped into the key slowly, a message not to any specific place, but to anyone listening. If you find water, leave some. If you find hope, pass it on. Then he mounted up and disappeared into the vastness once more. By then, the people of the region had begun carving signs along the trail, wooden arrows etched with the outline of a canteen. The symbol of Clay's kindness had become a guidepost. Even as towns grew and the railroad advanced, the desert still belonged to those who rode quietly and gave freely. And somewhere in that silence, Clay's story continued. Not because he chased it, but because he let it go, like water slipping from a calloused hand. Years passed like dust in a sunbeam, seen only when the light caught just right. Clay grew older, but his eyes never dulled. He began to slow his pace, choosing softer trails and longer rests. The Appaloosa, graying at the mane, still walked beside him like a shadow made of flesh and bone. They had become more than horse and rider. They were a testament to miles shared, battles endured, and silence honored. The west around them had changed. More fences, fewer stars. But the spirit of the desert still lived in certain places, and in certain men. In the small town of Esperanza, people gathered one evening for what they called the water vigil. They placed candles in canteens, setting them on porches and windowsills to honor the legend of the rider who never asked for thanks. Children listened as elders told stories of the old cowboy, who gave water to strangers and faced down gangs not with rage, but with resolve. No one had seen Clay in years, but none believed he was gone. Some said he had ridden into the mountains. Others, that he'd become part of the land itself. On that same night, high on a ridge overlooking Esperanza, Clay watched the flickering lights below. He didn't go down. He didn't need to. Seeing the glow was enough to know his presence remained. He sat beside the fire, took out the folded note from the family he'd once saved, and read it again. "May you never ride alone." It was true now. He never truly did. Every hoofprint he left had carried more than weight. It had carried memory, kindness, and a story that others chose to carry forward. Just before dawn, Clay rose, packed his bedroll, and took one last look at the town bathed in candlelight. He mounted the Appaloosa and rode east, where the morning sun waited to warm the ground he hadn't yet touched. His shoulders ached, his breath slower, but his soul moved with a peace earned only by men who've given more than they ever took. And though no one knew where he went after that, canteens kept appearing along the old trails. Fresh water in old places, a symbol that someone still remembered, that someone still cared. And every time a stranger stopped to drink beneath the unforgiving sun, they'd pause, look toward the horizon, and whisper his name like a prayer carried by wind, Clay. The cowboy who left water and gave the West back its soul. In a land where survival was measured in footsteps and mercy was as rare as rain, one man chose to leave more than tracks. He left hope. Clay's story isn't just about a canteen of water or the strangers who returned with a horse. It's about the unspoken truth that in a world hardened by time and trial, small acts of kindness still echo louder than any gunshot. His quiet generosity created a ripple through the desert, touching hundreds of lives, and reminding even the most jaded hearts that there's still room for decency under the sun. The legend grew not because Clay sought fame, but because the West needed stories like his, true stories. In a place ruled by grit, lawlessness, and the relentless search for fortune, he gave something greater: compassion. The man who once drifted without destination became a compass for others. And through every hidden canteen, every rider who found strength in his trail, his legacy carved itself into the bones of the land. Clay may have ridden alone, but he never truly was. He carried within the weight of every soul he chose to help. What makes his story unforgettable is not the horse, not the 300 riders, not even the reclaimed spring. It's the fact that he chose to give when he had little, and to stay invisible when the world tried to glorify him. There's something sacred about a man who doesn't need to be seen to be remembered. And maybe that's what we've lost today. The understanding that real strength comes from silent service, that heroism often rides in without a name or a flag. Now, the trails he once walked are still dry, the wind's still harsh, but the story lives on. Every time someone stops to offer water to a stranger, or looks past their own thirst to save another, Clay rides again. His story invites us to ask, what legacy are we leaving behind? Are we walking through this world only to survive? Or are we willing to be the reason someone else does? If this story moved you the way it has moved so many others, take a moment to honor its spirit. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next journey. Like the video if it touched something in you. And share in the comments. What would you leave behind in the desert? Your voice matters. Let this space be a fire we gather around, telling stories that remind us who we are and who we still can be.